April 1945. Northern Germany had already begun to collapse, not with explosions, but with silence. Entire towns stood abandoned. Roads once filled with military convoys were now littered with discarded helmets, broken rifles, and empty fuel drums. German soldiers were surrendering in groups. Some didn't even wait to be asked. But British forces moving toward the Elbe River weren't looking for ordinary troops anymore. They were looking for someone else. A name that had been circulating through intelligence briefings for weeks. A senior SS commander responsible for coordinating forced labor transports and security operations across several occupied regions. His orders had moved thousands of people across borders. His signature had approved entire facility evacuations. And now, according to intercepted reports, he was still somewhere inside Germany, trying to disappear. Major Thomas Whitaker of the 6th Airborne had been given one instruction before his unit crossed into the sector. If you find him, do not harm him. No explanation, no details, just that, which didn't sit well with the men under his command, because they had already begun uncovering what the SS had left behind. Burned records, evacuated camps, empty transport lists that ended abruptly in April. Whatever this officer had been involved in, it wasn't frontline combat, and yet now the order was to take him alive. 2 days later, near a quiet administrative compound outside a town that had already surrendered, British scouts reported movement inside what appeared to be a former regional headquarters. No guards, no perimeter, just a light still burning on the second floor. Whitaker's patrol entered cautiously. Inside, they found stacks of paperwork, partially destroyed communication logs, and maps with evacuation routes marked in red pencil. Someone had left in a hurry, but not everyone. Upstairs, behind a locked office door, they found a man in a gray uniform sitting at a desk. No weapon, no attempt to flee, just a leather briefcase placed neatly beside him. He looked up as they entered, and calmly said, "I was wondering when you'd arrive." The room went silent. One of the British sergeants stepped forward. Name and rank. The man paused for a moment, then replied, SS Obergruppenführer Karl Brenner. Whitaker froze. That was the name, the one from the briefing, the one they weren't allowed to kill. But as the patrol secured the office, something else caught their attention. The briefcase, locked, heavy, and marked with a red wax seal bearing the SS insignia. Whitaker picked it up. Whatever was inside was important enough for him not to destroy it, and important enough for London to want this man alive. The arrest itself had taken less than 30 seconds. No struggle, no resistance. SS Obergruppenführer Karl Brenner had simply stood up from behind the desk, adjusted his uniform cuffs, and waited as British soldiers surrounded him. But what came next wasn't standard procedure. Whitaker expected field interrogation, a holding cell. At the very least, immediate questioning by intelligence corps officers attached to their brigade. Instead, the order came through the radio less than 20 minutes after Brenner was secured, and it wasn't from brigade command. It was from London. Directly. Prisoner is to be transported under armed escort immediately. No field interrogation authorized. No documentation to be reviewed at unit level. Whitaker read the message twice, then a third time, because it didn't make sense. The briefcase alone could contain evacuation routes, contact networks, or identities of other SS command personnel still attempting to disappear across collapsing sectors. Yet, now, they were being told not to open it, not to question him, not even to review the documents they had risked their lives to capture. Sergeant Miles stepped closer. "Sir, with respect, what if he knows where others are?" Whitaker didn't respond immediately, because that was exactly the problem. If Brenner knew something, they needed it now. Every hour mattered. Entire SS administrative chains were dissolving into civilian populations across Germany. Some officers had already escaped using forged transport papers, And now they had one of the men responsible for coordinating those networks, sitting in the back of a British transport truck. Untouched. Unquestioned. The convoy moved out just before midnight. No markings. No lights beyond what was absolutely necessary to navigate the ruined streets. Brenner sat between two armed guards in the rear compartment, hands restrained, his briefcase placed on the floor between his boots. At one point during the drive, he leaned slightly forward and spoke, not to Whitaker, but to one of the younger soldiers across from him. "You should not open it." The soldier frowned. "What?" Brenner's voice was calm, measured. "The documents inside are not meant for you. No threats, no urgency, just certainty." The truck hit a pothole hard enough to shift the case slightly across the metal floor. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Whitaker reached down and steadied it with his boot, because for the first time since the arrest, it felt less like evidence and more like a warning. By the time they reached the temporary airfield outside Shell, another order was waiting. This time, even stranger. "Prisoner is to be prepared for immediate transfer. Destination classified. Escort unit not authorized beyond runway." Whitaker stared at the message in silence. They weren't just taking Brenner into custody. They were taking him away from everyone. The airfield outside Kell wasn't on any operational map Whitaker had been given. No unit markings, no standard RAF ground crews. Even the perimeter security looked different. The men guarding the runway weren't from his brigade, and they weren't wearing airborne insignia, military police, but not attached to any division he recognized. The convoy rolled to a stop beside a transport aircraft already running its engines. No lights beyond the bare minimum. No paperwork exchange. No confirmation of identity. Just a single officer waiting near the loading ramp, holding a clipboard and a sealed envelope marked with a classification stamp Whitaker had never seen before. He stepped forward. "Major Whitaker?" Whitaker nodded. The officer handed him the envelope. "Your orders end here." There was no rank insignia on the man's shoulder. No unit patch. Just a name tag. R. Halverson. Inside the envelope, a single typed sheet. "Prisoner transfer is to proceed under Section Black. Escort unit is not authorized to observe embarkation. No record of custody to be entered at this time." Whitaker read the last line again. No record of custody, which meant, officially, they had never captured him. Behind him, Brenner was being escorted down from the truck, still calm, still silent, as if he already knew where this was going. Sergeant Miles leaned closer. "Sir, what does that mean?" Whitaker didn't answer, because he didn't know, and neither, it seemed, did anyone else on that airfield. The guards stopped at the edge of the ramp. Halverson raised a hand. "That's far enough." Two new personnel approached Brenner. Different uniforms. No visible insignia. No weapons drawn. They didn't even look at the British soldiers, just at the prisoner. One of them produced a key, unlocked Brenner's restraints, and handed him back his briefcase. Miles stepped forward instinctively. "Sir, he's a prisoner." But Whitaker grabbed his arm before he could say another word, because Brenner wasn't resisting. He wasn't trying to escape. He simply adjusted his coat, took the case, and walked up the ramp on his own. No chains, no escort, no urgency. At the top of the ramp he paused, turned slightly, and looked back toward the British soldiers. For a brief moment, it didn't look like surrender. It looked like acknowledgement. Then he disappeared inside. The aircraft door closed. Engines roared louder, and within minutes, the transport lifted off into the darkness. No call sign, no destination, no record that it had ever been there. Whitaker stood in silence long after the runway was empty, because something about this wasn't right. They hadn't delivered a prisoner. They had handed someone over. The airfield was gone by morning. Not destroyed, not evacuated, just gone. When Whitaker's unit returned to the location less than 12 hours later, following new routing instructions, there was nothing waiting for them. No aircraft, no MPs, no Halverson, No signs that any operation had taken place there the night before. Even the runway lights had been dismantled, as if someone had erased the entire transfer from existence. Back at Brigade Command, Whitaker submitted his report personally. Every detail: time of capture, condition of the prisoner, the sealed briefcase, the transport, the aircraft, the handover, and the order that had followed them from London. The adjutant accepted the file without comment, didn't ask questions, didn't request clarification, didn't even check the attached evidence log. He simply nodded once and walked it into the command office. 30 minutes later, Whitaker was summoned inside. His report was sitting on the desk, opened, stamped, and missing 3 entire pages. "The custody section has been removed," the adjutant said quietly. Whitaker frowned. "Removed by who?" The man hesitated, then turned the file slightly, enough for Whitaker to see the red marking across the top corner of the revised report. Section Black. Archival Restriction. Whitaker's jaw tightened. "That prisoner was in our custody for 6 hours. The adjutant didn't respond. Instead, he slid another document across the desk, a typed field log, dated that morning. Under Captured Personnel, the line read, "None." Whitaker stared at it. "That's not accurate." The adjutant nodded once. "I'm aware." "Then fix it." Silence. Because the report wasn't wrong. It had been corrected. Later that afternoon, Sergeant Miles approached Whitaker outside the operations tent. "Sir, the briefcase, did they log it?" Whitaker didn't answer immediately, because he already knew what the inventory record would say. No items recovered, which meant the documents, the evidence, the prisoner, had never existed. And yet, one detail still bothered him. When Brenner had walked up the ramp, he hadn't looked relieved. He hadn't looked defeated. He hadn't even looked uncertain. He had looked expected, as if this had always been the plan. There was supposed to be an interrogation. That was standard procedure. No matter how high-ranking the prisoner, capture meant questioning. Intelligence officers would establish identity, confirm operational involvement, cross-check known networks, and extract any information relevant to remaining SS command structures attempting to vanish across occupied territory. That was the system. That was the process. That was what every British officer had been trained to expect. Except this time, the interrogation room remained empty. Whitaker confirmed it personally the next morning. A temporary holding space had already been prepared before the convoy even arrived back from the airfield. A table, 2 chairs, recording forms, a standing lamp placed directly above the interrogation position. Standard layout, standard procedure, standard expectation. But Brenner had never been brought there. His name had never appeared on the intake log. No identification sheet had been printed. No questioning authority had been assigned. No timeline had been established for interview or transfer to higher command. It was as if the moment he stepped onto that aircraft, he had passed beyond the system entirely. Whitaker went to intelligence. The duty officer checked the internal registry twice, then a third time. "Are you certain of the spelling?" Whitaker didn't respond. He simply slid the capture report across the desk. The officer reviewed it slowly, carefully, until he reached the custody section, and stopped, because where Brenner's name should have been, there was nothing. No transfer record, no prisoner classification, no documentation linking the arrest to any operational unit, just a blank line. The officer looked up. "I don't believe we've processed this individual." Whitaker leaned forward. "You haven't processed him because you weren't allowed to." Later that evening, Sergeant Miles returned from the motor pool with something unexpected. "Sir, I checked the transport manifest." Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "And?" Miles swallowed. "There's no return trip listed for the aircraft," which meant the plane that had taken Brenner into custody was never scheduled to land. 3 days later, something finally appeared. Not in intelligence, not in command, but in signals. Whitaker had almost missed it. A routine communications update routed through brigade channels, most of it standard. Supply coordination, movement confirmations, temporary ceasefire notices from sectors already under negotiation. But buried halfway down the typed sheet was a single reference. Subject: Brenner. Status confirmed. No rank, no location, no transfer unit, just the name. Whitaker took the document directly to the signals officer who had received it. Where did this originate? The man adjusted his glasses. Routing chain indicates RAF command relay. RAF? That didn't make sense. The aircraft that had taken Brenner hadn't used a standard call sign. No flight plan had been logged through conventional air movement channels, which meant one thing: it hadn't been a normal RAF transport. Whitaker looked back at the line again. Status confirmed. Confirmed where? Confirmed by who? He flipped the page over. Nothing. No secondary notes, no attached routing orders, just the transmission header, stamped with a classification code he had already seen once before. Section Black. The signals officer leaned forward. I wouldn't pursue that, sir. Whitaker frowned. Why not? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached over and quietly removed the document from Whitaker's hands, placed it back into the communications file, closed it, and then said something Whitaker had never heard from a fellow officer before. Because the last man who asked about that designation was reassigned within the hour. Whitaker stood there in silence. Because reassignment during active operations wasn't unusual, but reassignment without orders, without paperwork, without destination. That was something else entirely. For the first time since Brenner's arrest, Whitaker began to wonder if the prisoner hadn't just been transferred to intelligence, but taken somewhere intelligence wasn't allowed to go. It didn't come through official channels. It wasn't stamped. It wasn't even signed. The document had been slipped between standard logistics reports sometime during the evening dispatch, buried deep inside an envelope marked for transport fuel allocation. Whitaker almost missed it entirely. Almost. The paper itself was different. Not standard field issue stock. Heavier, cleaner, typed with precise alignment. No visible mechanical inconsistencies from mobile command typewriters. Whoever had prepared it had done so somewhere permanent, somewhere with time. At the top of the page, Transfer Group, Priority Personnel. Below it, a list of names, not frontline officers, not political administrators, but specialists, engineers, communications coordinators, rail transport directors, security supervisors attached to evacuation units, and near the bottom of the page, one name already crossed out. Brenner. Carl Whitaker's grip tightened, because every other name on that list was still active, still unaccounted for, still somewhere inside collapsing German territory. Sergeant Miles leaned over his shoulder. What is that? Whitaker didn't respond, because the column beside each name didn't list rank, or unit, or location. It listed Destination Clearance. Some were marked, pending, others authorized. But Brenner's line was the only one marked, completed. Miles frowned. Completed transfer? Whitaker shook his head slowly. No, because the heading didn't say prisoner transfer or custody relocation. It said personnel extraction, which meant one thing. Brenner hadn't been taken into custody, he had been taken out, and now someone else was next. Whitaker didn't sleep that night, because the more he studied the list, the less it looked like a capture schedule, and the more it resembled something else entirely. Extraction implied intent. Coordination. Authorization, not arrest. By midnight, he had already matched 3 of the names on the page to separate SS administrative sectors that had gone dark within the past week. Communications had ceased. Personnel had vanished. Regional headquarters abandoned without engagement. At first, intelligence had assumed these were escapes, forgery networks, false transport manifests, civilian disguises. But now, Whitaker wasn't so sure, because each of the vanished individuals had held something in common. None were combat commanders. None were involved in frontline operations. They were logisticians, engineers, signals coordinators, rail movement planners, people who knew how systems worked, how transport routes were organized, how communications chains were established, how entire populations could be moved across borders without attracting attention. And now, they were disappearing. Whitaker pinned the final name to the operations map beside the others, then stepped back. Each location marked on the map formed a pattern, not random, not scattered, but sequential, from east to west, toward Allied-held territory. Miles looked up from the desk. "Sir, if we're not arresting them—" Whitaker didn't respond immediately, because the question had already formed in his own mind. If someone wasn't trying to stop these men from disappearing, then someone was helping them do it. The confirmation arrived just before sunrise, not through signals, not through intelligence, but through command itself. Whitaker was summoned without explanation. No briefing, no escort. Just an instruction to report immediately to the administrative office that had processed his original capture report days earlier. The same adjutant was waiting, standing beside the desk, holding a single envelope. No classification markings this time. No stamps, no routing tags, just his name. Typed, centered. Whitaker opened it slowly. Inside, a single authorization order. Short, direct, and dated 2 days before Brenner had ever been captured. Section Black. Authorization. All designated personnel listed under Priority Transfer Directive are to be secured and transported without standard interrogation procedures. Custody records are not to be entered at brigade or divisional level. Recovered materials are to remain sealed and transferred without review. Personnel are not to be classified as prisoners of war. Status: extraction required. Whitaker lowered the page, because the final line was what mattered. Destination: Allied Administrative Processing. Not detention, not interrogation, not tribunal. Processing, which meant the men on that list, including Brenner, had never been meant for trial. They had been meant for transfer. The adjutant spoke quietly. "You understand now why the report was amended." Whitaker didn't answer, because for the first time since entering Germany, he did. The aircraft hadn't taken Brenner into custody. It had delivered him, and whatever awaited him beyond that runway was something no field officer was ever meant to see. Whitaker left the office without another word, because the war was still going. The front was still moving, and officially, they had captured no one. The confirmation arrived just before sunrise, not through signals, not through intelligence, but through command itself. Whitaker was summoned without explanation. No briefing, no escort. Just an instruction to report immediately to the administrative office that had processed his original capture report days earlier. The same adjutant was waiting, standing beside the desk, holding a single envelope. No classification markings this time. No stamps, no routing tags, just his name. Typed, centered. Whitaker opened it slowly. Inside, a single authorization order. Short, direct, and dated 2 days before Brenner had ever been captured. Section Black. Authorization. All designated personnel listed under Priority Transfer Directive are to be secured and transported without standard interrogation procedures. Custody records are not to be entered at brigade or divisional level. Recovered materials are to remain sealed and transferred without review. Personnel are not to be classified as prisoners of war. Status: extraction required. Whitaker lowered the page, because the final line was what mattered. Destination: Allied administrative processing, not detention, not interrogation, not tribunal, processing, which meant the men on that list, including